Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. On today's show, Matt O'Lean had a chance to visit with a very special guest.
Coming up later on Prairie Pulse, we'll have a profile of guitar maker Kevin Miterman, but first, my guests are the Dean of the UND Law School, Catherine Rand, and also UND Political Science Professor Stephen Light. And they are here to talk about their new book, Indian Gaming, Law and Policy, and some updates they've made to that book from the first edition. But first off, why don't you tell folks about yourselves, where you're from, your background, how you got to UND. Catherine?
Thanks so much for having us here. I'm, as you said, privileged to serve as Dean at the University of North Dakota School of Law. I grew up in East Grand Forks, and after I finished up with law school at the University of Michigan, I moved back to North Dakota, and I've been thrilled to be here ever since.
Okay, Steve?
And I've been at UND since 2000 in political science, and right now I'm an associate vice president there. It's been a great experience working with all kinds of folks on public policy issues and constitutional law.
Okay, let's talk about your book on Indian gaming. What got you both interested in this field, and why write a book about it?
Well, our interest actually goes back quite a bit. After law school, I was clerking for a federal judge in Milwaukee, and one of the cases that he had was a tribal dispute over how gaming revenue was spent. I knew Steve at the time, talked with him about it. He was in grad school for political science. He suggested we write a paper together, and the rest is history.
Steve?
It's a really dynamic kind of industry where you think about the legal issues, you think about the public policy issues, you think about the economic issues, cultural issues, and so it's been a great collaborative kind of experience for us.
And Catherine, talk about the history of Native American gaming. When did it start? How did it get implemented with federal law, that kind of thing?
So the industry itself is not that old. If you go back to the 1980s, a few tribes were experimenting with card rooms and bingo palaces. Then in 1988, Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and that was what really ushered in the modern era of Indian gaming, the wide range of tribal casinos that we see today. So from 1988 to today, what we've seen is exponential growth in the industry.
Steve?
Yeah, it's really a dynamic industry, and what we're talking about is the kind of tribal casinos that many of the folks in the audience have been to. They're tribally owned, they're tribally operated, they're on reservation lands usually, and they've created jobs and created different kinds of opportunities for tribal and non-tribal members alike. So it's really a fascinating and growing industry.
And when did you write the first edition to the book? When did that come out?
So this is actually one of 3 books
Right.
that we've written, and we first did the first version of the book in 2006. And so even in a relatively short period of time, less than a decade, enough had changed in the industry that we did a number of updates related to some key United States Supreme Court cases, some changes in the law, and particularly changes in the politics regarding Indian gaming.
And talk about that Supreme Court decision, Steve. It's Carcieri versus Salazar. That's a key update, right, in this book?
Yes, the Carcieri decision was a really important one from the Supreme Court. It has to do with whether or not tribes are able to open casinos on non-reservation lands if a tribe was not federally recognized or federally acknowledged as of the time of an important federal law back in 1934. The main upshot is that it's thrown into question the opportunity for tribes to open casinos on newly acquired lands. So that's a decision that certainly sent waves through Indian country fairly recently.
So the decision went against the Native American gaming community then?
In effect,
In
yes.
effect.
And what it did is it made it more difficult for a tribe who that had been recently federally acknowledged post-1934, and there are a number of tribes in those intervening decades, made it more difficult for those tribes to be able to open a casino.
One of the interesting things about the court's decision in that case is that it cries out for a legislative fix, and the legislative fix would be easy. It's just a couple of words added to the statute. But the politics of Indian gaming have prevented Congress from acting on that, even though I think it's widely acknowledged the impact that the case has had on tribes and tribal gaming.
And what are the politics of Indian gaming? I mean, what are the sides? What if people don't know what that means, what is it?
So Indian gaming is actually quite controversial. You can pick up a newspaper and read about it just about every day. So in this particular circumstance with the Kacheri decision, as I mentioned, it's a two-word legislative fix, but folks would like to see constraints on Indian gaming be put into any legislation that impacts tribes. And that's what's held up the legislative reform there. But the politics are widespread.
Yeah, this is something where you're talking about 240 tribes that operate more than 400 tribal casinos across the United States. It's a $28 billion industry. It's grown exponentially over time. So when you think about the politics of it, there is no one politics. The politics in California or Wisconsin or Minnesota or Massachusetts or North Dakota, they're all different. They're all dynamic. And so that's sort of what's intriguing and what's fun about studying the industry is on a given election day, the politics might differ.
So what have been the economic impacts of Indian gaming on certain reservations? I'm sure some reservations have benefited more than others. What have been the economic impacts?
The economic impacts are varied, just as you said. So the economic impacts that we see in North Dakota are more focused on job creation in reservation communities versus the economic impacts for highly profitable casinos in California or Connecticut, where in those areas we see Las Vegas-style mega resort casino complexes. But throughout Indian country, across the United States, what we do see are positive socioeconomic impacts for tribes and tribal members.
Are there any negatives to Indian gaming that have come up over the years?
Yeah, I think when you talk about gambling writ large, folks get concerned about problem or pathological gambling. Gambling addiction, which is somewhere in the area, it's estimated of 1% to 2% of the population that gambles. There are issues related to petty crime or crime control that come with any industry and certainly with casinos. There are concerns, both about, when you talk about Indian gaming, there are concerns within tribal communities that are raised sometimes about the cultural impacts. The tribal culture is not static. It's not static for any tribe. But certainly there are changes that occur based on economic development and economic growth. And some in tribal communities say that's a negative.
I know one of the updates to this new edition is online gaming, correct? Catherine, what has been the impact of that?
So tribal casinos are bricks and mortar casinos. The federal law itself ties them to Indian lands. But the future of gambling is online gambling, particularly if you think about the mobile devices that we all carry around. That's the future of gambling. So one of the questions out there is if online gambling is legalized, as it has been in a few states, what will be the impact on tribal gaming? Will tribes continue to have a special status in terms of their ability to operate casinos? Will they be put out of business by the competition from mobile and online gaming?
And that's actually a really interesting question or set of questions because that probably is the future of legalized gambling. You have several states like Delaware or Nevada or New Jersey that already have taken it upon themselves to legalize online gaming. And as Catherine said, the question is what happens to tribes? One possibility is that the markets are actually really quite different. If you think about someone who's aged 21 to 30, who might be someone who plays video games, a young male, someone who loves to watch World Series of Poker, who loves to play poker, that's probably a different market than what you might see going to most casinos or most destination resorts. So it's possible actually that both versions of the industry can coexist.
Because you make a good point, Steve. When we think of casinos around here, who goes? We see elderly people flooding to these casinos. Why is that, Catherine, and what's been the impact of that? I mean, you mentioned gambling. I'm sure some people have gotten into trouble
Absolutely.
with losing money. Why do we see the older crowd at the casinos?
Well, one of the things that that we see with casinos is the divide between destination casinos, like those in Las Vegas, where people make a special trip to go there, or convenience casinos, like most tribal casinos, where you simply travel to the casino that is nearest, most convenient to you. So I think with tribal casinos, it became an opportunity for an outing for a lot of folks who might be retirees with some time on their hands and some new entertainment in town. So while we see a lot of older folks traveling short distances to gamble and pull the slot machines, ordinarily, as Steve said, when we think about gambling addictions, those run the gamut across the population. So there's not necessarily one segment of the population that's more at risk in terms of age. So I think for some people, the bus ride down to the casino is just a fun way to spend the day. For a few folks, it may be something that causes a problem in their lives.
What's been the impact of the musical acts within the casinos? I assume that's had a big impact. We don't see the Rolling Stones or Paul McCartney there, but we do see some of these acts on their second leg. You know, maybe their hit-making days are done. Has that been an economic impact, Steve, as well?
Yeah, actually, Matt, you raise an interesting point, which is that these tribal casinos, like other casinos, are not just about the gambling. In fact, what we're finding for destination resorts overall in Las Vegas and elsewhere for some of the big tribal casinos is more of the revenue comes from non-gambling sources than from the slot machines or table games themselves. So as the industry has grown and changed, and as some tribal casinos have mimicked destination resorts, they've got all the amenities that you would expect. They have the musical acts. It might be the 1970s or 80s acts that are still out there, but there's a market for them. It's golf courses. It's other kinds of musical acts. It's restaurants that are high quality. It's everything that you'd expect in a destination. And so, especially throughout the Midwest, I think a number of these musical acts that otherwise really would sort of be on their last legs, they make the tribal casino circuit. There's no doubt about it.
Catherine, one of the updates is on what the Great Recession did to Indian gaming. What was the impact? You can both comment on this.
Well, before the Great Recession, I think a lot of people predicted that legalized gambling was recession-proof, but this showed that that was wrong. We saw a very great impact, a surprising impact on legalized gambling, both tribal casinos and commercial casinos. The interesting thing, though, is that for the most part, the industry seems to have bounced back, including the tribal gaming industry. Perhaps Atlantic City seems hardest hit and perhaps most permanently so, but I know Las Vegas is bouncing back with great success.
If you look at the trend line from about 1996 to about 2006, so about a decade, tribal gaming revenues grew exponentially, literally across the United States in the aggregate. As you entered the recession years, although some of the tribal casinos proved recession-proof, overall what we've seen is a leveling off of total revenue. So it's a $28 billion industry today. That's highly significant. But as you roll back the tape 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years, it's basically leveled off. And so that's where the question of some of the other opportunities for growth come into play, whether it's new casinos on newly acquired land or certainly the online industry.
Another update you guys talk about is the Obama administration's stance on land acquisition, off-reservation casinos. Comment on that.
So because the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs has such a strong influence on tribal gaming, you'd expect that when a presidential administration changes, those things would change as well. And that's what we saw from Bush to Obama. We saw more openness toward Indian gaming, more support of tribal land acquisition, and so forth. But that said, I think that the change was not as significant as many would have predicted at the beginning of Obama's administration.
I think one of the interesting dimensions of what you ask and what Catherine's talking about is the fact that who's in the federal government really matters to tribes. One of the places we start when we think about Indian gaming and across our 3 books is the concept of tribal sovereignty, which might be sort of a foreign concept to many, which is basically that because of the pre-constitutional and extra-constitutional history for tribes, they operate as sovereign governments that in some ways are outside the bounds of the authority of federal, state, or local governments. That's surprising to some folks, but it's true. And so what we talked about in the first book is the idea that Indian gaming really represents a set of compromises, political compromises, legal compromises, and some of those actually compromise tribal sovereignty. They undercut tribal sovereignty in some ways. So who's in federal office does matter, and sometimes that helps tribes and sometimes it hurts them.
In your research, did you find any mafia influences in the North Dakota, Minnesota setup or not? Or is that more in the East and West Coast?
It seems like casinos and organized crime go hand in hand, and that certainly is the mythology surrounding gambling. For Indian gaming, with 3 layers of regulation at the federal level, at the state level for casino-style gambling, and of course at the tribal level, we see, it appears, no more than the usual kinds of increases in crime that you'd expect when you're drawing people into any community. So while folks have been on the outlook for that type of thing, we haven't seen much evidence of it.
Okay. Steve?
And at some level, I think that's a reflection of the 1988 federal law, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, that in many ways gave birth to the modern Indian gaming industry. The fact is that at the time, Congress was really concerned about the possible influence of organized crime or the infiltration of organized crime into tribal casinos. And what that law did was create those 3 layers of regulation that Catherine mentions. It's a robust enough regulatory system, and also tribes have become increasingly sophisticated in their regulation of Indian gaming, that you just don't see that kind of old school mafia influence.
In our region, of course, we have White Earth, Fort Berthold, Fort Totten, Fort Yates. Is there 1 or 2 reservations where it's really helped more than the others, the Indian gaming, in your research?
I think in our part of the country, there are a few things that you can generalize about tribal casinos. That for our region, they're mostly in rural locations on reservation lands. They are modestly profitable, and the most important role they play is as a job creator that drives a tribal community's economy. So in our part of the country, in North Dakota, South Dakota, and in northern Minnesota, no one is getting rich off of tribal gaming. It's not the scope that you see on the 2 coasts, but it's very important to the tribal communities, and increasingly is allowing tribes to diversify their economies and grow them in different directions.
Steve?
It's just such a fascinating industry that actually the question you ask makes me think about what are the popular images and popular stereotypes about Indian gaming. And one of them might be that all tribes or all Indian people have gotten wealthy off of Indian gaming.
Which is not true.
Which is not true. And we talk in this book and in our other work about a spectrum of success, the relative spectrum of economic success and other forms of it. When you look at the tribes in North Dakota that you reference, it's really about revenue in the tens of millions of dollars. It's about job creation in the hundreds of jobs. That creates a major impact. But the popular image of Indian gaming, what you see on cartoons or on TV, whenever there's a reference to tribal casinos, might be one where it's about the so-called casino Indian or wealthy Indian. And that just really hasn't happened.
We just got a few seconds left. If people want to get the book or colleges want to get the book, where can they go? How can they get it?
Of course, Amazon.com.
Yep, of course.
But also, it's published by Carolina Academic Press, CAP.
Okay.
Yeah, and we sure appreciate the opportunity to visit about it. It's such an intriguing industry, and we're glad to share.
Okay. Steve Light, Catherine Rand, thank you for being here on Prairie Pulse. Again, the book is Indian Gaming, Law and Policy. Stay tuned for more.
Kevin Miterman is a reconstructive plastic surgeon by day and a guitar maker by night. After medical school, the Thompson, North Dakota man decided to learn more about guitar building and trained with master builders at the Leeds Guitar Maker School in Massachusetts. By combining advanced material like Kevlar and carbon fiber with wood and traditional guitar building wisdom, Kevin builds double-top acoustic guitars that are technically brilliant as they are beautiful.
There isn't a single moment when I'm in here making guitars that isn't joy. I'm Kevin Miterman, and I'm a guitar maker, and I've been doing that for about 18 years, and I'm also a plastic surgeon in town. I've been a guitar player since I was about 9 years old. For some reason, the tone of the guitar, first time I heard a guitar played well, it just thrilled me to no end. Since I was quite a young person, I've always built things. And when I was in high school, there was a guitar maker there. He had a guitar store where he would sell regular guitars, Martins and Taylors and all those things you hear about. The guitars that he was making sounded better, intrinsically better, and I wanted to know why. Then I went off to medical school residency. But then when I started my practice, I decided I wanted to recapture some of these things that make life special. And so I would take my vacations from my job, and I would go off for, say, a week or two at a time to a guitar making school in Massachusetts and work with these master guitar makers. And once I'd learned what I needed, I started building guitars myself, and I've been doing it ever since. It's meditative. People ask oftentimes how this relates to surgical skills and surgical training, and I think that it really is very much the same. In other words, my joy for working with my hands, I suppose, came first, and it manifested in my job, which is surgery, but also my working with wood. And surgery is, I love doing it, but there's an intensity to it, and this is sort of the antithesis of that intensity. It's peaceful and is completely without tension, and that's lovely. And so once the shape is determined, then you determine the woods you're going to use, and sometimes that's a purely aesthetic choice. Sometimes certain players want a certain wood for a certain tone. So I kind of get all those things, literally put them on the bench and start designing when it's just raw, rough hunks of wood. This is where everything begins. I buy the wood in a rough form. For example, here's some East Indian rosewood that still has the saw cuts on it from the mill. Its mashing sides are here, and these are also rough, but they'll be eventually thinned on the sander and then bent into their shapes. And so I used to have only 2 shapes of guitar, and now have collected 8 or 10 different sets of work boards. So here's how a neck begins, a big hunk of wood. But then at some point you get down to just whittling it, basically. These are little surgical lights that I bought from a surgical supply house. I also learned that in the operating room there are always 2 lights, one over each shoulder, so no matter where you're working, you're eliminating the shadow. And so when I'm working, I'll often use my 2 little lights, and I'll have 1 light coming over each shoulder. And so no matter where I'm working, there's never a shadow. And that makes for some great detail work. It's fun to see as you start scraping back, bringing the woods level and getting the glue off of there. It's fun to see the lines pop. This is rosewood and this is poplar, and it's fun to see as you're scraping the result poke through. And then I assemble the back to the sides, and I have the first step. And then I start on the top. I choose those woods. All right, so this is the way I make my tops using the composite materials. So traditionally, a top for a guitar, which is the vibrating element of it, comes out of a single book-matched set of wood. These days, people are using composite materials to try to get a guitar top that is as resonant and is as strong, but is actually lighter, so you get more sound and maybe even more controllable sound. from the audience perspective, no one would know there's any difference. For example, this is a double-topped guitar with all the composites and all the fancy things inside the guitar, but you'd never know it. All guitar tops are not just a piece of wood, but they're braced somehow on the inside with a series of braces. Traditionally, these are solid wood. I use a little thin sheet of carbon fiber, sandwich that between two thin pieces of wood, and you get a brace that is inflexible because of that almost like an I-beam on the inside. It's very strong. If I get a request from a guitar player for something, I'll work it up in a prototype first so that I can change one element at a time to try to hone in on the sound that they're looking for without having to build a whole new guitar. So there's a 6-string. Here's a 12-string prototype. This is a Nara wood guitar. It's got a really big sound. I look forward to coming in here at the end of a long day. I guess I'm sort of a geek. In other words, I don't do much besides my work and spend time with my family and then make instruments and plan guitar concerts. It's really a good life. It's a simple life, but it's mine and I like it.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the North Dakota Council on the Arts and by the members of Prairie Public.